Millions of people still burn incense today, at home, in churches, in temples, during meditation, in small rituals before bed. But almost no one stops to ask a simple question. Why? For thousands of years, in practically every civilization on record, did human beings believe that a fragrant smoke could carry something from earth up to heaven? That's not a small question, and the answer runs through Egyptian temples, Hebrew altars, Buddhist monasteries, Christian cathedrals, and trade routes that crossed entire deserts just to move a handful of resin, on a journey that could take months and cost a fortune, all for something you couldn't eat, wear, or build with your own hands. Incense was never just a pleasant smell. It showed up as purification, as an offering, as protection, as the gesture that marked the line between ordinary space and sacred space in cultures that never exchanged a single word with each other. Again and again, when an ancient civilization wanted to get closer to the unseen, the gesture was almost always the same. Burn something that came from the earth and watch the smoke rise. That's not coincidence. That's symbolism repeated across the whole of human history. To understand why this happened, you have to go back to a time when perfume wasn't an everyday luxury. It was extreme rarity. Resins, aromatic woods, and herbs had to be gathered, dried, and often carried for months before reaching a temple. Smelling good, in that world, wasn't an aesthetic detail. It was a sign of power, of purity, of separation from the ordinary. Whoever could perfume the air around them was, in some way, marking that this moment, or this place, wasn't like any other. The word perfume itself carries that origin inside it. It comes from Latin, from the combination of per, meaning through, and fumis, meaning smoke. Perfume, at its oldest root, literally means through smoke. Before any bottle, any oil, any liquid essence ever existed, perfuming something meant, quite simply, burning something. Nowhere in the ancient world was this more built into daily life than in Egypt. There, incense practically followed a sacred work schedule. Frankincense burned in the morning. Meraknon, and a more complex blend of resins, known as kifi, reserved for nighttime, used both in temples and in embalming rites. The Egyptian Book of the Dead itself describes these resins as the sweat of the gods, fallen to earth. A poetic way of saying that scent never really belonged to the human world to begin with. Egyptian priests even used the soot from these same resins to prepare the coal worn around the eyes, carrying the sacred, quite literally, onto the face of whoever burned it. The resin was so essential to this sacred routine that one of ancient Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, Hatshepsut, organized an entire naval expedition to a distant region known as Punt, generally linked to the coast of the Horn of Africa, with the goal of bringing back living frankincense and myrrh trees, roots and all, to be replanted in the gardens of the temple itself. Stone reliefs that survive to this day record that expedition in detail, proof that securing the supply of aromatic resin was treated as a genuine matter of state. And that same instinct, burning something earthly to reach the heavens, shows up independently in practically every major civilization around Egypt, in deserts, valleys, and mountains that never had any direct contact with one another. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets confirm that priests used incense and fumigation in purification rites and magic, part of a priestly tradition carefully recorded in writing centuries before most of humanity could even read. These same peoples already linked specific scents to specific deities, a system of correspondence that would later become common across nearly every organized religion. In India, that same logic emerged completely independently. In the ancient Vedic fire rituals known as Yajna or Homa, where priests fed a sacred flame with aromatic woods, grains, and clarified butter, believing the resulting smoke carried the offerings straight to the gods, a practice that survives today in the form of Hindu puja, present in millions of temples and home altars in China. The same gesture served a slightly different purpose, keeping alive the connection between the living and the ancestors who had already passed on. It became so woven into daily life that craftsmen even developed incense clocks. Sticks and spirals of fragrant material that burned at such a steady rate they were used, quite literally, to tell time, fusing the sacred and the practical into a single tool. Meanwhile, in Greece and Rome, incense also took on social weight. At Delphi, incense was burned as part of the sacred atmosphere of the sanctuary of Apollo, even though the Pythia's own prophetic trance was attributed by the ancients to vapors rising from a fissure in the rock beneath the temple, not to the incense smoke itself. A mystery historians and scientists still debate today. In Rome, later on, the gesture would take on political weight as well. Refusing to burn incense before a statue of the emperor could be read as an act of treason against the state itself, proof of how an originally spiritual symbol could, over time, take on the weight of civic loyalty. Notice the pattern repeating, civilization after civilization, with no real reason to believe one knew the other existed. Fire, transformation, smoke rising, a substance born of the earth, something you can touch, weigh, store in a jar, is handed over to fire, and what's left of it disappears upward, in a motion the human eye can never quite follow to the end. None of these civilizations exchanged letters, maps, or traders with each other in the earliest centuries of this practice. Egypt didn't copy Mesopotamia. India didn't copy China, and yet, separated by thousands of miles, and no direct contact at all, every one of them arrived at the same quiet conclusion. Fire is the right tool for turning matter into message. Think for a moment about how different this process is from almost any other religious gesture. A statue stays right where it is, solid, still. A sacred text stays the same paper, the same ink, year after year. But incense, in the exact moment it fulfills its purpose, stops existing the way it started. It isn't stored or preserved or repeated as an object. It consumes itself, transforms, and disappears. And that disappearance is exactly what carries the meaning. Almost no other sacred object works this way. An idol, a cross, a book. All of them remain, generation after generation, exactly as they were handed down. Incense is the opposite. It only completes its purpose in the instant it stops being an object and becomes air. Maybe it's exactly that detail, the smoke vanishing from sight, that led so many different cultures to see it as a kind of bridge. Something that is matter, solid, concrete, turns into something invisible and rises in the exact direction the ancients imagined their gods lived. It's no accident that the most common function of incense across nearly every tradition is this one. It's what connects the visible to the invisible, what carries upward, the very thing the human body alone could never lift. And in no tradition does this symbolism appear in a more structured way than in the biblical one. Inside the temple, described in Hebrew tradition, there was a specific altar, smaller than the main altar, dedicated to a single function, burning incense every morning and every evening, following an exact recipe made of specific resins that no one outside the priesthood was allowed to reproduce for personal use. The smoke that rose from that altar was described within the tradition itself as a direct representation of the people's prayers rising up to God. A priest burning incense and the people praying outside were, symbolically, the same scene, playing out on two different planes at the same time. This was no decorative detail of the temple. It was considered one of the most sacred acts performed there, repeated every single day, without exception, generation after generation. It's during exactly one of these moments, with a priest named Zechariah taking his turn to burn incense at the altar, alone, inside the most sacred space an ordinary priest had access to, while the crowd prayed outside, waiting. The Christian tradition records one of the most striking angelic appearances in the entire account. An angel appears right there, inside the cloud of smoke, announcing the birth of a son who would become known as John the Baptist. Notice the choice of setting, out of every possible place. The revelation arrives precisely in the instant the smoke of prayer was rising. Within that same tradition, two resins in particular carried a symbolic weight that would last for centuries. Frankincense and myrrh both begin as a sticky sap oozing from cuts made in the trunks of specific trees, hardening on contact with air into small, translucent beads that, when burned, release a dense, almost resinous scent. Unlike any common plant, frankincense was associated with royalty and priesthood, used both in temples and in the most solemn ceremonies. More bitter, darker, carried a different weight. It was also used to prepare bodies for burial, tying the same scent to both sacred life and the passage into death. It was precisely these two resins, alongside gold, that Christian tradition describes as the gifts brought by wise men from the east to a newborn child in Bethlehem, after following, according to the account, a star on a journey of months. Gold to recognize royalty, frankincense to recognize sacredness, and more quietly, almost prophetically, to recognize that this life would also face death. Three gifts, completely different from one another, and still each one carrying, in its own way, a message about who that child would be. None of the three was a toy or a piece of clothing. They were, above all, statements. Worth noting, not every tradition within the Bible welcomed just any incense. There are accounts of incense burned outside the authorized formula being treated as a grave offense, proof that, within this culture, the gesture was never about the scent itself, but about intention, authorization, and respect for what the act represented. In other words, burning something fragrant wasn't enough. It had to be the right thing, done the right way, by the right person. This same principle, that incense marks the line between ordinary space and sacred space, shows up in almost identical form in traditions that never had any direct contact with one another. Before any important ceremony, in practically every ancient culture, someone would move through the space burning some resin or aromatic herb as a way of declaring, with no words needed, from this point on, this place is no longer ordinary. It's almost as if scent worked like an invisible sign, perceptible only to the senses, marking off one side from the other. This is the first clear function of incense throughout history. Purification, clearing the air, symbolically, of everything that belonged to the everyday, preparing both the space and the people present for something out of the ordinary. Temples were purified with incense before important ceremonies. Homes were purified before births or after funerals, marking the end of one period and the start of another. Even moving into a new home, in some cultures, was first marked by the smoke of some incense passing through every empty room. Even today, in various spiritual traditions, the gesture of passing fragrant smoke over the body or through a space, sometimes called smudging, follows that exact same ancient logic, including indigenous practices from different parts of the world. From the burning of sage in Native American traditions to the use of specific herbs. In Afro-Brazilian and Amazonian rituals, the second function, just as widespread, is prayer. In practically every tradition that uses incense, the same central image shows up. Smoke carries upward what the human voice alone could never reach. Requests, gratitude, pleas, laments. Rising smoke became, over thousands of years, one of the most widely used spiritual metaphors in human history for prayer itself. Something that starts out small, visible, within arm's reach, and turns into something that rises, spreads, and disappears beyond what the eyes can follow. It's no coincidence that, across so many different languages, describing a sincere prayer almost always means describing something rising, not something staying put. There's a third function, less talked about, but just as present. Protection. In various traditions, certain scents, especially the strongest and rarest ones, were believed to create a kind of barrier against unwanted presences, whether described as spirits, negative energy, or simply the emotional weight left behind by something difficult. In some cultures, newborns were welcomed with fragrant smoke within their first days of life, as a form of symbolic protection before any other ritual took place. Soldiers, travelers, and merchants, before setting out on long and dangerous journeys, sought that same kind of symbolic protection too. Burning incense in a space before someone entered it, or after an illness, or before an important trip, was a way of saying, this space is protected. This moment is covered. But there's also a far less spiritual layer to this story, and it might be the one that best explains why incense outlasted so many different empires, surviving wars, changes of government, and the fall of entire civilizations. Money, frankincense, and myrrh didn't grow just anywhere. The trees that produced these resins were concentrated mainly in specific regions of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, arid, hard-to-reach territories. The Romans called Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia, precisely because of the wealth that trade generated. Entire caravans of camels crossed the desert, carrying these resins along trade routes connecting southern Arabia to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, and later to Rome, on journeys that could take months and cross territory controlled by dozens of different kingdoms, each one collecting its own toll along the way. Merchants kept the exact locations of the producing trees secret for generations. At a time when that kind of information was worth as much as a treasure map, these resins became so valuable that chroniclers of the time compared their worth to gold itself, and some rare varieties were reserved exclusively for royal or priestly use, out of reach for ordinary people. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder went so far as to record, in detail, the origin and trade of these resins in his Encyclopedia of the Natural World, describing with no small amount of astonishment how much Romans paid for something that, at its origin, was nothing more than the hardened sap of an ordinary tree growing among rock and sand. The biblical tradition itself records the visit of a queen from the south, generally identified with the region of Modr and Yemen, bringing to Solomon's court large quantities of aromatic spices as part of a display of wealth and respect between the two kingdoms. That kind of gift wasn't decorative. It was quite literally part of a nation's treasury, carried by an entire procession across hundreds of miles of desert. Over the centuries, this trade built entire port cities devoted to this single purpose, places that grew and thrived purely around the export of aromatic resin. Some of them recognized today as historic landmarks, precisely because they were once central points along that fragrant route. Empires went to war, or formed strategic alliances, partly over control of these routes. It's hard to think of another product in the ancient world where the sacred and the economic were so deeply intertwined. The same resin that perfumed an altar also funded entire economies in distant regions, financing armies, palaces, and fleets of ships. For functions, so far, for a single kind of smoke. Purification, separating ordinary space from sacred space. Prayer, carrying upward what the voice alone can't reach. Protection, building a barrier against what shouldn't be present. And power, moving entire empires through trade routes built around a single resin for very different functions, and still all born from the same physical gesture. Light the fire, and let the smoke do the rest. Over time, that same gesture spread and adapted into practically every major religious tradition in the world. In Christianity, the practice inherited from Hebrew tradition continued, and still continues today. In many churches, especially within the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, incense is swung in specific vessels called censers during important ceremonies, symbolizing, exactly as it did thousands of years ago, the congregation's prayers rising up to God. For millions of people who grew up within these traditions, that specific smell is tied directly to memories of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. In Judaism, even though the incense altar of the ancient temple no longer exists, destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago, the memory of that practice still lives on in the scriptures themselves and in liturgical prayers recited to this day, a reference that outlasted the physical loss of the temple itself. In Buddhism, burning incense before an image of the Buddha is one of the most common gestures of devotion in temples around the world, with the act of watching the smoke slowly dissipate used as a meditation on the impermanence of everything that exists, a visual reminder that everything born also transforms and disappears. In Hinduism, incense remains central to nearly every household act of devotion, present in millions of homes every single day, often paired with a small bell rung. At the exact moment the smoke begins to rise, in Taoism, incense smoke still marks moments of meditation and respect for one's ancestors. And across indigenous traditions in different parts of the world, the same principle shows up independently, again and again. Fire transforms and smoke carries. It's hard to look at so many cultures, separated by oceans, languages, and entire millennia, arriving at the exact same basic practice, and call that pure coincidence. Today, of course, most people lighting incense at home are thinking about unwinding after a hard day, setting the mood for meditation, or simply making a room smell nice before guests arrive. The motivation has changed quite a bit. No one needs to organize a naval expedition, or pay the equivalent of gold, or cross a desert in a camel caravan for months just to get a handful of aromatic resin. Today, it's sitting on a shelf at any store for a fraction of what it used to cost. But the gesture itself, lighting something, watching the smoke rise, feeling the room shift, is the exact same one kings, priests, monks, healers, and completely ordinary people repeated, without interruption, for thousands of years. When someone today lights incense before meditating, they're repeating, maybe without even realizing it, the same gesture as an Egyptian priest standing before a statue, a monk standing before an image of the Buddha, or a Hebrew priest standing before the altar of the temple. The difference is that today, no one has to ask permission from an entire priesthood or pay the equivalent of a fortune to repeat that gesture. Maybe incense became sacred across so many different cultures for a reason too simple to notice at first glance. It's one of the few things in the physical world that visibly transforms right in front of your eyes, from matter into something that seems to stop being matter at all. The resin comes from the earth. Fire transforms it, and what's left of it rises, spreads, and disappears into a sky no hand has ever managed to reach. No statue does that. No. Only fire, and whatever it consumes, can actually demonstrate the idea that something can stop being body and become spirit. Think for a moment about how many other human gestures try to do exactly that. Take something concrete, physical, ordinary, and turn it into something that goes beyond the limits of the body. A prayer whispered under your breath, a thought set aside for someone who's gone, a silent wish kept only for yourself. Incense may have become, over thousands of years, the most visible and most physical version of that same invisible need. Humanity's always carried the need for some part of us, however small, to cross the line between what can be touched and what can't. Unlike a silent prayer, though, incense offers something rare, visual proof, however brief, that the crossing actually happened. It's not an exaggeration to say that few simple objects have crossed so many civilizations, so many languages, and so many centuries, while carrying the exact same core meaning. Swords changed shape. Coins changed material. Flags changed color and symbol. But the gesture of burning an aromatic resin before something sacred, watching the smoke rise, has stayed almost untouched, from ancient Egypt to someone's meditation room today, on the other side of the world, with no need for that person to know a single thing about pharaohs, Hebrew priests, or camel caravans. Maybe it's because, deep down, the question incense answers never really changed, in any era, at any latitude. How do you reach what your own hands can't reach? How do you send a request further than your own voice? How do you prove, even just to yourself, that something exists bigger than what you can hold in your hands? In the end, maybe humanity summed up one of its oldest beliefs in a single action, repeated in nearly every language and every faith ever recorded. Burn a piece of the earth and call the smoke that raises a prayer.